You're here for the insights, the core knowledge that cuts through all the noise. Welcome to the Deep Dive.
That's right. You send us the material, we dig in and pull out what really matters.
Helping you get informed without getting buried in information.
And today, we're diving into some really fundamental economic ideas.
We are. You sent over some excerpts from Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics. This is the 5th edition from back in 2014.
Yeah, and our mission really is to unpack these core concepts. Things like scarcity, productivity, how prices actually work.
And then look at the real world side, especially things like price controls, what governments try to do versus, well, what often ends up happening.
The intended versus the unintended consequences. It's a major theme.
Okay, let's jump right in. Maybe start with the absolute basic. Scarcity sounds simple, but it's kind of everything in economics, isn't it?
It really is. Simply put, it just means that society's wants, our collective desires, always outstrip the resources available to meet them all.
And it's not just about being poor, right? That's a common misconception.
Exactly. So Joel points to that New York Times piece about middle-class Americans worrying about money.
Oh, yeah, the one with the picture of a swimming pool next to the headline about economic anxiety.
Right. It perfectly illustrates that scarcity isn't just poverty. Even when you have a lot, relatively speaking, you still face constraints, trade-offs. Your desires can still exceed your means.
That image really does stick. And Sowell stresses this point. Every single economic system, capitalism, socialism, feudalism, whatever, has unmet needs. That's baked in because of scarcity.
The systems are just different ways of grappling with the unavoidable trade-offs that scarcity forces on us. Who gets what, basically?
So it's less about eliminating scarcity, which is impossible, and more about how we manage it.
Precisely. How we make those choices. And that leads to the next point. Economics isn't just slicing up the current pie. It's also crucially about making the pie bigger.
Ah, productivity, increasing the total output.
Yes. It's about how we become wealthier as a society, how we have more available to meet those wants.
And so Sowell brings in this idea, I think it was a quote, about the impossibility of, like, perfectly organizing everything.
Yeah, organizing everything rationally without waste. It highlights the inherent limits. No system, no planner can manage an economy with perfect efficiency. There are always complexities, information gaps.
Which makes you think about how resources do get allocated, if not perfectly from the top down.
Well, that brings us right to prices and costs. They're more than just numbers on a tag.
Right, so it's pretty clear. Prices in a market aren't just arbitrary figures plucked out of thin air by sellers.
Not at all.
Wow.
I mean, a seller can ask anything, but the market price emerges from what buyers are actually willing to pay.
And what competitors are charging for similar things.
Yeah, exactly. That example he gives is great.
Yeah.
You might think something's worth $100 to you, and someone offers it for $80. Good deal, right?
Seems like it.
But if another seller right next door has the exact same thing for $70, you're probably going with the $70 one. Competition matters. Consumer choice matters.
Which pushes back against the simple explanation you sometimes hear, just blaming high prices on greed.
Yeah, Sowell frames that as a common viewpoint, but maybe not a fully economic one. It overlooks the role of supply, demand, and competition.
And the idea of cost is broader too, isn't it, from society's perspective?
Very much so. The real cost of anything is its value and its next best alternative use. What else could those resources, that labor, that material have produced?
Opportunity cost again.
Right. And market prices, ideally, reflect that underlying reality. They force us collectively to weigh those alternative uses and, in a way, share scarce resources.
So economies using prices to coordinate things tend to be more efficient at allocating those scarce resources than, say, systems run by central commands.
Generally, yes, because prices transmit information incredibly efficiently. Think about what people want, how much is available, how difficult it is to produce. It's all condensed into that price signal. Kings or central planning committees just don't have access to that level of real-time dispersed knowledge.
It's interesting you mentioned that. Sowell brings up Friedrich Engels, of all people.
Yeah, co-author of the Communist Manifesto.
Who apparently observed, during a brief period of more openness in the Soviet Union, how price fluctuations actually informed producers about what society needed more or less of.
It's a fascinating observation, isn't it? Because centrally planned economies inherently lack that feedback mechanism.
Yeah.
How do you know if you're making too much steel and not enough bread without market prices?
Which also ties into this confusion. Sowell points out the difference between the economically available supply at current prices and the total physical amount of a resource that exists on Earth.
Ah, yes, the running out of oil predictions.
Exactly. People look at known physical reserves and divide by current consumption and say, oh no, we only have 30 years left.
But that ignores how price changes affect things. If oil gets more expensive, people find ways to use less, and companies invest more in finding new reserves or developing alternatives. The economically viable supply changes.
It's not a fixed number. And this misunderstanding, or perhaps ignoring, of economic reality is often behind government intervention in prices, right? Often for political reasons.
That's often the case. Which leads us right into the minefield of price controls.
Okay, so before we get into the controls, just recap the normal function. In a free market, if demand shoots up, prices tend to
Rise to balance supply and demand.
And if supply increases or demand drops, prices tend to
Fall. Again, find that equilibrium. It's a constant adjustment process.
Got it. So what happens when the government steps in and says, no, the price can't go above this level or it can't fall below this level? Let's start with price ceilings, like rent control.
Right. Rent control is a classic example. Sowell uses the post-World War II period. The intention was obviously to keep housing affordable.
Seems like a good goal.
Sure. But what happened? Even where the physical number of apartments was adequate, you got shortages. Why? Because at the artificially low price, more people wanted rental housing, and they wanted more of it than was available or than they would have demanded at a higher market price.
So the low price itself increased the quantity demanded.
Exactly. And it changes behavior in other ways. People are less likely to economize on space. Why squeeze into a smaller place if a larger one is kept artificially cheap? It also reduces the incentive for people with spare rooms to rent them out.
And Sowell gives those almost absurd-sounding examples.
Or the Hollywood stars keeping rent-controlled apartments in New York they barely lived in.
Yeah, or people primarily living in Hawaii keeping a rent-controlled place in San Francisco. It sounds crazy, but economically,
It makes perfect sense. If the rent is far below market value, why give up such a bargain even if you don't really need the space full-time?
it really underscores how powerful incentives are, and it leads to inefficient use of housing stock, doesn't it? That San Francisco statistic was striking.
The 49% of rent-controlled units having just one occupant.
Yeah.
And you also see situations where long-term tenants, maybe empty nesters, are paying very low rent for large apartments in prime locations, while young families are struggling to find anything affordable.
So it distorts demand. What about the supply side? Does rent control affect the building of new apartments?
Hugely. Sowell cites Melbourne, Australia. After WWII, apparently no new apartment buildings were constructed for 9 years because rent controls made it unprofitable. Similar story in Egypt after 1960.
Wow. So the policy aimed at making housing affordable actually reduced the long-term supply of housing.
That's the critical distinction Sowell keeps making. Intentions versus consequences. You have to look at the incentives the policy creates, not just the stated goal.
Okay, so lower supply, increased demand leads to shortages.
Right. And people stop renting out spare capacity, granny flats, extra rooms because the controlled rent doesn't make it worth the hassle or the cost.
What about when they exempt new buildings from rent control? Does that solve it?
Well, it helps get new buildings built, but it creates another weird situation. You can have small, basic, newly built apartments renting for more than much larger, older, sometimes nicer apartments that are still under rent control.
So you get these huge disparities in rent for basically comparable living situations.
Exactly. It's a common feature in cities with long-term rent control. In Europe and the U.S., the market is distorted.
And when prices are held down like this, doesn't it often lead to, well, other ways of allocating goods, like black markets?
Absolutely. The Soviet Union is a prime example.
Right.
Sowell mentions the 150 ruble decree. Apparently that was the going rate, the bribe, to get price-controlled goods moved between regions where they were needed.
Even with severe penalties.
Even when the penalty for black marketeering, especially early on, could literally be death, people still did it. Soviet economists themselves noted that speculators risking everything were the ones bringing grain into starving cities during the period of war communism. The suppressed price system failed, but the black market, driven by real supply and demand, functioned, albeit illegally and dangerously.
It's a powerful illustration. And this isn't just housing or food, right? You see similar things in healthcare.
Yes, where prices are controlled or services are provided free by the government, demand increases. More people want to see the doctor for minor things, which can mean longer waits or less access for people with serious conditions.
Leading to rationing in other ways.
Exactly. So all gives those really troubling examples from Britain's National Health Service, the young girl getting a breast implant while thousands waited for more critical surgeries.
And the cancer patient whose operation kept getting postponed, it's heartbreaking. It highlights the trade-offs that someone, somewhere has to make when prices aren't allowed to ration care.
And it works the other way too. Price floors, where the government keeps prices artificially high.
Like agricultural price supports.
Right. The goal might be to help farmers, but it can lead to massive surpluses that nobody wants at that high price. Think about those huge stockpiles of wheat and rice in India that Sowell mentions existing alongside widespread poverty.
Because the government was buying it up to keep the price high for farmers.
Exactly. Or Canadian farmers protesting because market prices for wheat were low, even though they were already getting subsidies. It becomes a very complex and often wasteful system.
And the levels of these subsidies vary wildly across countries, right? The US, South Korea, Norway.
Oh, yes. Some governments pour enormous sums into agricultural support.
And then there's the extreme case, like Zimbabwe under widespread price controls. What happened there?
Complete economic collapse, essentially. Shortages of absolutely basic goods, food, fuel. Meat disappeared from butcher shops. Gasoline was unobtainable. Hospitals ran out of essential medical supplies. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when you try to completely divide market prices across an entire economy.
It really demonstrates the destructive potential, even in less extreme situations like after a natural disaster.
Right. Price controls then can seem humane, preventing price gouging.
Yeah.
But Sowell argues they actually worsen shortages. Well, if the price of, say, hotel rooms or gasoline isn't allowed to rise after a hurricane knocks out supply, there's less incentive for people to conserve. And, crucially, there's less incentive for suppliers from outside the affected area to bring in extra supplies, because they can't charge a price that covers their extra costs and risks.
So the higher price would actually help allocate the limited resources and encourage more supply to come in.
That's the argument. It sounds counterintuitive, maybe even harsh, but the price signals work to alleviate the shortage faster than keeping prices artificially low.
Whereas in normal times, if demand for something just drops off, businesses don't need a law to tell them to lower prices.
Of course not. They have sales, they offer discounts, they don't want to be stuck with unsold inventory. The market adjusts downwards naturally. Price controls prevent those necessary adjustments, up or down.
This all seems to point towards this idea, so Sowell brings up systemic causation.
Yes. That's the concept that outcomes in a system, like an economy, aren't necessarily planned or intended by any single individual. They emerge from the interactions of everyone pursuing their own goals.
He quotes Engels again, doesn't he? Something about
What each individual wills is obstructed by everyone else, and what emerges is something that no one willed. It's a powerful way to think about complex systems. My actions affect you, your actions affect me, and the overall result might surprise us both.
And it warns against those simple explanations again, like just blaming greed for everything.
Right. Like why prices might be higher in a poor neighborhood. It could be higher costs, insurance, security, maybe smaller volume purchases. Or why a pawnbroker charges high interest rates. It reflects the high risk of default on those kinds of loans. There are often underlying economic reasons beyond simple malice.
So understanding supply and demand and how prices mediate them is crucial to seeing these systemic effects.
Absolutely. It helps predict how things will actually play out when you intervene, not just how you hope they will, like the example of lousy service in Soviet restaurants.
Yeah.
Because there was no incentive from market prices or competition to provide good service.
Pretty much. The managers and workers got paid, regardless of whether customers were happy. No profit motive, no fear of losing customers to a competitor. The systemic incentives weren't there.
So prices, fundamentally, are a way of rationing scarce goods.
Yes. Scarcity is the underlying reality. Prices are one way to deal with it. If you suppress prices, you don't get rid of scarcity.
You just force rationing to happen in other ways.
Exactly. Waiting lists, queues, personal connections, rationing coupons, black markets, sometimes even just physical fighting for limited goods. Prices, for all their imperfections, are often a more efficient and less arbitrary rationing mechanism.
And ignoring this role of prices is behind a lot of policies that sound good but backfire.
That seems to be Sowell's argument. Policies intended to be humanitarian can end up harming the very people they're meant to help if they disrupt the price system without understanding the consequences.
What about that phrase, production for use rather than profit? Sowell tackles that too.
He does. He argues it's a false dichotomy. In a market economy, businesses generally make profits by producing things that people want and can use. If nobody wants your product, you don't make a profit for long.
So the profit motive is actually tied to producing useful
In
things.
most cases, yes. He suggests the real contrast isn't use versus profit, but rather who gets to decide what is produced and allocated. Individuals making choices in the marketplace, or politicians and bureaucrats making choices for them.
Okay, so wrapping some of these threads together. Scarcity is fundamental.
Always.
And scarcity inevitably means competition for resources.
Yes, under any system, capitalist, socialist, whatever, the only choice is how people compete. Will it be through prices, political maneuvering, waiting in line, or something else?
And most of us don't even think of our daily shopping as competing, but in a way.
It is. You're competing with everyone else who wants that same loaf of bread, that same gallon of gas, by being willing to pay the price.
Which brings us to the importance of the rules of the game, the economic institutions and the incentives they create.
Critically important. So Cowell points out how costs often get ignored when people are spending other people's money, taxpayer money, for example.
Or when costs are imposed on businesses or individuals in ways that aren't easily measured, like complex regulations, red tape.
Right. There's less incentive to be careful with costs you don't personally bear or that aren't immediately obvious.
And that connects back to politicians often trying to control prices rather than the underlying costs that drive those prices up, like in healthcare.
Yes. Controlling the price tag feels easier or more politically popular than tackling the complex factors that make healthcare expensive. But price ceilings, as we saw, prevent the full costs from being paid somewhere in the system.
Which then leads to shortages or declines in quality or availability.
Exactly. It's a recurring temptation for governments. Try to bypass the reality of costs and scarcity through controls, subsidies, or declaring something a right that the government will provide without fully grappling with the resource implications.
So the bottom line for this section seems to be that treating prices as just annoying obstacles rather than as vital information signals.
Leads to a lot of trouble. It's the source of many policies that, despite good intentions, end up being counterproductive or even harmful.
Okay. That covers a lot of ground from Sowell's basic principles. Before we wrap up, you mentioned having a final thought for people to chew on.
Yeah, just something to consider. We've talked a lot about scarcity being inherent, about competition being inevitable, and about prices as signals. So, the question is, what are the real long-term societal trade-offs we make when we choose policies that try to suppress those market signals through things like price controls or heavy subsidies? Think beyond the immediate goal, beyond the first effect. What are the ripple effects down the line?
That's a deep one. What are those unseen consequences, the paths not taken because we interfered with those signals? Definitely something to mull over. Well, thank you for taking this deep dive with us today into these fundamental economic ideas.
It was fascinating to revisit them.
Hopefully, this discussion, drawing on the Sowell excerpts you provided, gives everyone a better handle on scarcity, the crucial role of prices, and why understanding these basics is so important for looking critically at economic policies and their real-world outcomes.
Yeah, thinking about the incentives created and the potential for unintended consequences.
Absolutely. We hope you'll think about how these principles connect to economic debates you hear about or things you observe yourself. And as always, if you have other sources or topics you think warrant a deep dive, please do send them our way.